Before we start talking about value-based education, values education, it's good to start defining values. Now, values are things we attach importance to, and we can usually divide them in terms of material values as well as moral values, right? Material values encompass things like material wealth and fame and celebrity status and so on, whereas moral values might encompass certain moral traits such as honesty and gratitude and humility and so on. Okay, and then when we talk about values education, we're talking about explicitly teaching learners about certain values and the depth and breadth that those values encompass. So for example, if we're talking about gratitude in practice is not just saying thank you for something, it's also expressing it in your actions. So for example, if there is a person or a community that has contributed to your betterment and you want to show that you're grateful, you will make contributions towards that person or towards that community to enable them to make such contributions in the future. So that is an example of gratitude in practice. Value-based education, on the other hand, in contrast to values education, focuses more on creating an environment that's conducive to the development of these values. Now, when we talk about younger learners, they usually don't think as abstractly or concretely or in depth about these concepts of values and moral values. So value-based education provides a stronger foundation where teachers or adults in their lives, that could be teachers or other members of the school, or it could also be parents, who model certain kinds of behaviors, and through modeling these behaviors, they relay the importance subconsciously to these learners of why it's important to behave in a certain way. Okay, another thing that we do in value-based education is that you're supposed to develop a certain kind of vocabulary, okay, that helps students identify what kinds of moral values they're exercising, right, and how to articulate moral action and moral thought. And the last thing that it does is a value-based education. In order for a value-based education to be successful, it's supposed to provide a space for learners to think and reflect and give them enough time to internalize and embody these values. Now, from value-based education, we can move on to something known as character education. Now, when we talk about character, we can broadly and simply define character as all the features and traits and qualities that an individual possesses. So an individual's character is defined by his features and traits. And character can be subdivided into two categories, although these aren't independent of each other, namely moral character as well as performance character. Moral character has to do with the pursuit of achieving a certain moral status and moral identity, whereas performance character has to do with mastery, orientation, or excelling at whatever you do. Right now, the reason why I say that they're interdependent and not independent of each other is because one can't survive without the other. There is necessarily a performance component to moral character, and there is a moral component to performance character. So as an example, we can think about moral character. For example, if we're talking about moral character, we might say that I want to strive to be an honest person. I want to strive to always be humble and not judge others, and always want to see the positive in others, right? Whereas as a performance character, I might say that I always want to work hard. I want to be disciplined in my thoughts as well as in my action. I want to be organized, right? Now, when we talk about pursuing a certain moral character, we might think, okay, if I want to be an honest person, it necessarily requires me to discipline myself. If I want to be a humble person, for example, in an interaction with someone else, if I think of myself as superior to someone, I have to exercise discipline and thought to correct myself at that instant and realize that what I was doing was in contrast to what I perceive as morally correct. So that discipline, although we may perceive it as a component of performance character, is an essential component in achieving moral character. Or vice versa, if you're talking about performance character, someone who wants to perform well might have ill intentions. So for example, if my intention is to harm others and I perform well in that endeavor, right, that doesn't mean that that's the kind of person we want. So a person might perform well in certain things. However, we also want to ensure that an individual who is displaying performance character is also doing so with the right intentions or moral attitudes. So we realize that these two are inherently intertwined. So now that we realize that performance character and moral character are inherently intertwined, we have to recognize that there are certain things that we have identified that constitute a person of character. The first of those things is that a person is a responsible and respectful moral agent. Okay, so that individual is constantly exercising certain moral values, moral judgment, moral reasoning to most encounters in his life. So the second thing that a person should embody is something known as a social. He or she should be socially and emotionally skilled as an individual. Now that encompasses a few different things. First of all, in order for someone to be socially and emotionally skilled, they have to be self-aware and mindful, right? So when they're mindful, they're constantly aware of what we've already discussed, how their actions are affecting others, how they themselves are thinking along certain moral lines or certain values that they hope to embody. Okay, but it also means that that person therefore also has a wholesome awareness of others. Okay, and they're able to navigate their relationships in an effective way, and they're able to resolve conflicts effectively. The third thing that a person who embodies character is that he is self-disciplined. Now, discipline comes in many different forms. It comes in thought, it comes in action. Okay, it also comes in speech. And when we talk about a disciplined person is someone who is constantly thinking along a certain set of values or a certain set of morals. All his actions are intended to embody those certain values and morals, and that person applies discipline to his everyday life, and he prioritizes his own physical, mental, and emotional health. Okay, so the fourth thing that a person of character might embody is that, or another thing that a person of character might embody is the desire to learn always. Something we call a lifelong learner, because it's essential to realize that even as we grow as individuals, right, certain values or certain morals might stay the same. How we practice or exercise those morals might change. For example, at a certain point, we might have considered it acceptable, for example, and conventionally it had been considered acceptable to discipline your children physically, for example. But what we've realized, newer knowledge, especially recent work in psychology, has made us realize that this affects children almost always in a negative way, or pretty much always in a negative way. So then once we have that knowledge, right, it sort of necessitates a change in behavior on our behalf and how we treat our children. So if we're ignorant to new knowledge, if we don't have this desire to learn, right, so lifelong learning doesn't only link to academic achievement or certain progress when it comes to your ability to retain and reproduce information. It also has an essential implication on your interactions with others in your everyday life and how you live your life as a moral human being. Another thing that people of character must embody is a desire to serve the community and demonstrate citizenship or democratic citizenship. Now what that means is that it's a realization that we as human beings are social individuals, and that our success is not just grounded in our own discipline and how we think about ourselves, but also in how we think about others and how we treat others. Now, one of the things that a lot of people confuse is the difference between religiosity and spirituality. And a person of character demonstrates something known as spirituality. Now, someone may be spiritual without being too religious, or someone may be religious without being too spiritual. Not to say that someone can't be both. But when we talk about spirituality, it's about seeking a purpose in life. Because when we seek a purpose in life and we answer those questions about our purpose in life based on these moral and value-based dimensions that we've identified, it leads to us fostering a very wholesome self-identity. And it's that pursuit of self-identity that results in our progress as individuals, and it results in the development of our character. So spirituality is an essential component of character. So when we talk about learners having developed a certain character and embodying certain values, in the real world they're faced with many obstacles. For example, we might live in a society that may reward morally unjust behaviors. It may reward individuals who are taking shortcuts as opposed to, working diligently and hard and putting in time and effort into whatever they do in a disciplined way. So how do we counteract these changes? Well, So when we talk about ingraining this idea or this importance of character and values into students, it has a few different components to it. The first idea is to appeal to the thinking or the cognition of a child. So when we talk about cognition, we're talking about conscious thought. So there has to be a question raised as to how it affects the individual and how it is beneficial for the individual to exercise certain values in a certain way. Now, an example of this is, for example, what we've learned about character education is that, and value-based education is that it does enhance academic performance. It enhances, and it also improves the quality of your life. And it also leads to talent. It also leads to talent improvement or better talent being produced. So what we've learned is that when students demonstrate these traits of character or demonstrate these certain traits that we've outlined, it leads to an improvement in performance in school and beyond, and it leads to a more fulfilling life, right, by way of the relationships that they foster. Now, when we talk about these things, so that's appealing to the cognitive aspect, okay, showing them how these things can prove to be beneficial. And one way to do this is to show them examples of individuals. A certain example that I like to discuss, that I was discussing with a friend the other day, was the example of scientists in during the time in the Catholic Church, in the Renaissance or pre-Renaissance period, when the Catholic Church was at the peak of its powers. Now, at the time, a lot of scientific views were viewed as heathenistic. They were viewed as sacrilegious, and a lot of these scientists were executed, in fact, for their contributions. However, what we realized was much later, their contributions changed the course of humanity for good or for the better. It led to the advancement of modern day science. So what we realize is that a lot of times society might not value certain things, but because these individuals had such a strong moral identity and concept of self and an understanding of why what they were doing was the right thing to do, there was a certain belief in them that drove them. And they might not have seen their work actualized in their lives, but there were definitely innumerable rewards for their work in the years that followed. So that's appealing to the cognition of an individual. Now, when we talk about, or you can also come up with relevant everyday examples of individuals who have demonstrated moral character and moral strength, and their life has not been without struggles. They've been faced with many obstacles, and what they've done is they've been morally sensitive throughout. So when we talk about moral sensitivity, they have been aware of what the right thing to do is, regardless of the imminent outcome, because there was a belief that the eventual outcome would be a positive one. So that leads us to something known as moral judgment. Now, moral judgment necessitates deliberate, conscious thought. It necessitates an individual thinking and imagining how their actions or how what they say or what they do might affect certain outcomes. Because when we have gray areas and we're faced with multiple outcomes, or none of those decisions that you make are black and white, it's difficult to choose which is the right decision and which is not. And that's where we make moral judgments. We think about what the possible outcomes could be of our decisions, and we think about and we judge based on our certain morals and convictions which of those decisions is best. Okay, and this is something that over time, as we exercise this moral sensitivity and moral judgment, it leads to some positive outcomes, and that motivates us morally. So that leads to moral motivation, which reinforces our moral sensitivity, and it also reinforces our ability to judge morally. So this process becomes more and more autonomous. So there is a deliberate effort initially to pursue difficult thought, to think about things and make yourself uncomfortable. But eventually what happens is you internalize these aspects of your thinking, and you become you embody a better moral character. Now, so those are the stages when we talk about moral development, when we talk from moral sensitivity to moral character. And this is not necessarily a linear progression, right? Moral character affects your moral sensitivity and vice versa. Another thing that we realize is that rather than just appealing to the cognition or the conscious thought of a child, you also have to you also have to appeal to the emotion of a child. So when we talk about, for example, so there's a very interesting example where children were asked the right thing to do, and they were asked questions based on. So before we talk about that, let's talk about values or morals, and actually think of them in two different ways. We can think of values as normative values. So those are values that are defined in a socio-cultural context, or we can think of them as moral values, which are basically, to some extent, universal values. For example, trustworthiness is something that all human beings value between each other. So you can think of that as a moral value. Now, when children at a very young age were asked whether it was okay to, let's say, they were asked about table etiquettes. They were asked about table etiquettes, for example, if using a fork versus eating with your hands. Now that, whether it's okay to eat with your hands or eat with a fork, the answer varies based on the social context. In certain cultures, it's considered better to eat with your hands. For example, in Pakistan, when we're talking about a religious context, it's considered better to eat with your hands. Whereas in the US, you might say that, they, especially when they go out, when we're talking about eating at restaurants, good table manners are using a fork and a spoon. So that answer may vary. However, when children were asked to let's take an example of my friend entrusting me with a secret and me disclosing that secret to a third person. Now, when children are asked about the actions that I committed or the act that I committed, children believed that my actions were not morally correct. And that was something that we saw across many different social or cultural contexts. So that actually showed that students themselves embody a certain set of intrinsic values, even if they can't articulate them or consciously think about them. And the way they do that is they actually think about how it would make them feel. So if they had entrusted someone with a secret and someone would have done wrong to them, how would they feel? And based on that understanding, they perceived my action as the wrong thing to do. So we realize that children do have this inner set of human values, even if they don't express them. So we want to appeal to their emotions. When we want them to become moral agents, we want to ask them, what kind of a person would I want to become? How would my actions make others feel? In other words, how would those actions have made me feel if I had committed those things, or if someone else had done those things to me? So you have to appeal to the emotions of these learners as well. So we've appealed to the thought, the conscious thought and the cognition, and we've appealed to the emotions or the effect. This is called the affective aspect. And the last aspect is the social aspect. Right? Again, as we know that, especially at a younger age, when and even later on, what we realize is that when we talk about society and we talk about when society reinforces certain kinds of actions or certain kinds of behaviors, even though they may not be consistent with moral values, right? It leads to an individual disowning those values. And there was another example of a study where there were college students, and college students had shown an increase in sensitivity towards other people's opinions, and they were more open-minded and they were more inclusive of others and open to listening to opposing views. However, those effects, even though they showed a positive trend during their 4 years in college, those positive trends showed a decline the moment they left college. And over the next 5 years, all the positive influences that college had on those individuals had depreciated. So what we realize is that it's not enough to restrict this character and moral education to certain limited settings. It's not enough to leave it to just the social aspect of, for example, let's say a school or a college. It's also important to appeal to the emotions as well as the inner thinking of an individual or a learner. And it's important to do this always. So it's not limited to home. It's not just parents who teach between right and wrong. It's also teachers, and it's also the community as a whole. Now, certain steps that educators or teachers can make is, first of all, when we talk about ethics and we talk about morals, that should be a certain criteria for teaching. Okay, so when we talk about a community can be a larger community or a smaller community. The classroom itself is a community, the school is a community, right? The neighborhood the school is in is a wider community, and so on and so forth. So when we talk about a community, right, it all starts with the smallest community, which is the home and the classroom. So you have your parents and your teachers who have to demonstrate or model these certain characteristics, right? And then so there's an essential component which is basically that we select teachers or we train teachers along these lines of ethical behavior and modeling ethical behavior. Now, the next thing that we can do is we can reinforce and reward certain kinds of moral acts. And one of the key things over here is to understand the role of assessments. For far too long, schools have assessed children based only on their academic achievement. And what we've understood now is when we talk about character education, it's no longer just one aspect of education. It is, in essence, something that you have to find in all aspects of education. So it's an overarching theme. It must be embodied by the teacher, it must be embodied by the student. So how do we reinforce or reward that behavior? Well, one way to do it is, for example, highlighting when someone has been acting kind, for example, or when someone has acted grateful, or when someone has shown care for others, right? It's also providing students an opportunity to demonstrate these acts of kindness. So, for example, community service. And interestingly, what we've realized is that in order for individuals to embody certain values, they have shown greater engagement in the community. What we actually realized was that there was a positive relationship between how much children served or how much learners served the community, okay, and how much they served or how active they were as citizens, and the moral values that they embodied. And what was initially thought was that those moral values led to them pursuing community service or serving in their communities or cities, for example, right? However, what we actually realized was, So what we actually realized was that the reason why these individuals embodied certain values was because they had engaged in community service. So it was the social act of engaging in community service and helping others that led to an awareness that these are the right things to live by and these are the right ways to think about things. So moral values are actually developed as a consequence of constant engagement and exposure to your community. So you have to provide that environment, whether it's in the classroom or beyond the classroom, where learners have an opportunity to engage with others in a positive and meaningful way and make contributions. And this leads to their moral development. So what we realized is that rather than the fact that people who have certain moral values actively participate in community service and actively demonstrate citizenship, it's the other way around. Active participation in the community and active citizenship has actually proven to be conducive to the development of certain moral character and moral values. So that's one of the essential aspects of moral development, is providing an environment where people can positively interact with each other, whether it's in the classroom or beyond. So when we talk about moral education or value-based education and character education, we realize that even though it is beneficial to have a component of that explicitly taught through, let's say, an ethics curriculum, it's more important that all of these themes of certain moral values and ethical thinking and demonstrating certain traits of character is embodied throughout a child's everyday experience, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's in their specific subjects, whether it's in their lives at home, or whether it's in their intrapersonal or their own individual interactions, or their interaction with themselves, or their interactions with others. And this kind of thinking, this kind of positive outlook, and this kind of feeling, and this kind of social interaction can lead to promising outcomes, whether it's in their academic or school achievement, whether it's in their extracurricular achievement or their achievement in sports, for example, whether it's their achievement beyond school, beyond their school lives at their jobs, or whether it's their overall happiness in life. So it leads to a more fulfilling and happy life as well.